Welcome back, everyone. Before we start tonight's video, I need you to ask yourself a question. Have you ever clicked on an online listing that seemed too good to be true? Free housing. Incredible deals. Easy money for simple work. We've all seen them. Those posts that make you stop scrolling because the offer is just so perfect, so convenient, that it feels like fate brought it to your screen at exactly the right moment. But here's the thing about offers that seem too good to be true, they usually are. Tonight, I'm bringing you 3 deeply disturbing stories about people who responded to Craigslist ads. People who thought they were getting a great deal, a fresh start, or an easy opportunity. What they got instead was something far more sinister. These aren't urban legends or creepypastas. These are real experiences from real people who came face to face with predators hiding behind friendly messages and enticing offers. Before we dive in, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a sketchy experience with an online listing or marketplace? Something that made your instincts scream danger, even though everything looked legitimate on the surface? Drop a comment and share your story. Your experience might help someone else avoid the same mistake. And if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I post true horror stories like this regularly, and you definitely don't want to miss them. One more thing before we begin, these stories get progressively more disturbing. The first one is unsettling. The second one is worse. And the third one, well, you'll see. So get comfortable, turn up your volume, and whatever you do, remember this. The next time you see an online offer that seems too perfect, ask yourself why someone would be so generous to a complete stranger. Because sometimes, the price they're asking isn't money. Story 1. The free housing arrangement. This first story comes from a young woman I'll call Rachel. It happened in 2017, when Rachel was 21 years old and going through what she describes as the lowest point in her life. She dropped out of college during her first year, a decision that had basically destroyed her relationship with her parents. Her mother and father saw it as throwing away her future, and their disappointment turned into genuine anger that poisoned every interaction. Rachel wasn't speaking to her family anymore. She had only a handful of close friends she could trust. And she was working a dead-end job at a vape shop, barely making enough to survive. She describes this period as her apathy era, a time when she'd kind of lost the will to care about much of anything. One day, while mindlessly scrolling through Craigslist during a slow shift, Rachel saw an ad that immediately caught her attention. The post was from a man named Jackson who was advertising free lodging for a young woman willing to watch over his house and handle basic cleaning duties. Essentially an au pair or house sitter, but without having to watch any children. The listing included about 10 photos of the house, a modest, middle-class, single-family home that looked slightly old-fashioned but well-maintained and comfortable. But the photos weren't what grabbed Rachel's attention most. It was the fact that this position offered completely free living in exchange for housework. No rent, no utilities, no financial burden whatsoever. And perhaps most appealing to Rachel at the time, no background check required. Looking back, Rachel admits she didn't ask her family or friends for their opinion before responding to the ad. She just texted the number listed on the posting. This Jackson guy responded within minutes. Rachel expressed interest and asked basic questions about the arrangement. He had detailed answers to everything, which actually made Rachel feel more confident about the legitimacy of the offer. But fairly early in the conversation, he asked what her gender was. When Rachel said female, his responses seemed to get noticeably longer and more enthusiastic. Rachel didn't care at the time. Most people prefer having a female housekeeper or nanny, it's a common bias in domestic work. She rationalized it away immediately. Jackson explained that he wouldn't be home during the day most of the time due to his work schedule. He wanted to come home to a clean house, and he mentioned he wouldn't mind occasionally coming home to a cooked meal after long shifts. Rachel was fine with all of that. If it meant free housing and escape from her parents' constant judgment, she'd happily cook some food and keep a house clean. Plus, Jackson said he'd pay for all the groceries. Rachel would just need to do the shopping and cooking. It was starting to sound almost too good to be true. Jackson suggested Rachel come by later that same day to see the place in person and determine if it would be a good fit. Rachel agreed immediately. A few hours later, she was driving her beat-up Civic to Jackson's address. The house was in a perfectly normal area of town, the kind of quiet, middle-class neighborhood where people keep their lawns trimmed and kids ride bikes on the sidewalks. The neighboring houses had flower gardens and seasonal decorations suggesting normal, stable families lived there. Good start, Rachel thought. She rang the doorbell, and when the door opened, she was greeted by a man who was both larger and significantly older than she'd pictured. Rachel had imagined a regular-looking 45-year-old dad type. Instead, this was a man probably in his early 60s, about 6 feet tall, with a gray beard and a slight beer belly. But he greeted Rachel with a huge smile and immediately went in for a hug, even though they'd literally just met in person for the first time. The warmth of his greeting actually put Rachel at ease. He seemed friendly, grandfatherly almost. Jackson showed Rachel around the house. It was a 2-story layout. The first floor had your basic kitchen, dining room, and living room setup. Nothing fancy, but clean and functional. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Jackson showed Rachel the guest room she'd be using and the bathroom, but the other doors upstairs remained closed during the tour. He mentioned that if Rachel ever needed to use the office across the hall, she was welcome to. Down the hall was his bedroom and another room that he didn't explain at all, just gestured vaguely toward it without opening the door. Rachel was surprised to learn there was only 1 bathroom for the entire house. That seemed like it could get awkward, but she didn't mention it. Finally, Jackson showed her the basement entrance. He said it was unfinished and that he only used it for working out and doing laundry. That was the end of the tour. Notably, Jackson didn't show Rachel the backyard that day. Rachel told him she wanted the position, and Jackson immediately said she was hired. 2 days later, Rachel came back with all her belongings packed into her car. When her parents asked where she was going, Rachel told them she'd gotten an apartment. She didn't explain anything more, and they didn't push for details. Their relationship had deteriorated that much. The first night in Jackson's house was when Rachel noticed the cameras. They weren't hidden, at least not as far as Rachel could tell. They were just small black security cameras mounted in the corners of the living room and kitchen, visible if you looked for them. It made perfect sense to Rachel at the time. Jackson was letting a virtual stranger live in his house. Of course he'd want some security and the ability to check in remotely. Still, Rachel wished he'd mentioned the cameras during the initial conversation or the house tour. Their presence made her feel slightly weird about the situation, though she immediately rationalized the feeling away. If you can't tell yet, Rachel really wanted this arrangement to work out. That first night, when Rachel went to bed in the guest room, she noticed how much noisier the house felt compared to when they'd toured it during the day. She could hear the wood floors creaking periodically. At one point, she was certain she heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere downstairs. Rachel checked her phone, 1:30 a.m. She came up with rational explanations in her head. When you're lying in silence trying to sleep, you notice sounds you'd never pick up on during the day when you're occupied with activities. Plus, every old house makes settling noises, expansion and contraction from temperature changes, that sort of thing. The next morning, Jackson was already gone like he'd promised. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter with a list of tasks he wanted completed. Normal stuff: do his laundry, vacuum the floors, wipe down the kitchen counters and appliances, dust the living room. Rachel tried to focus on the positive. She wasn't standing behind a retail counter dealing with difficult customers anymore. This was easy work. She did Jackson's laundry first, then cleaned the floors and wiped everything down. After completing the tasks on the list, Rachel went back upstairs and started making the guest bedroom feel more like her own space. She unpacked her clothes, set up her laptop on the small desk, put a few personal items around to make it feel less temporary. Rachel remembers thinking, maybe this could actually work out. For the first time in months, she was being genuinely positive about her situation. After finishing everything, Rachel relaxed for a while and watched YouTube videos on her laptop. Not hearing her parents yelling from downstairs or having one of them burst through her door barking orders at her, that felt like a genuine breath of fresh air. The first week went pretty smoothly overall. At night when Jackson got home from work, they'd make small talk about basic things. Nothing ever got too deep or personal. He'd ask about where Rachel grew up, what she wanted to do eventually career-wise, general getting-to-know-you questions. Rachel cooked dinner several nights in a row, and Jackson seemed genuinely appreciative. She started thinking maybe she just overreacted about the cameras and the slight weird feeling. Everything seemed fine. But the peaceful dynamic didn't last. One night, Rachel made pasta with chicken and some vegetables. She tried her best, but cooking wasn't exactly her strong suit. She was a young, angsty girl who'd never been taught much about meal preparation, not some experienced home chef. When Jackson got home that evening, he looked tired and irritated before he'd even tasted the food. He took one bite, and his entire facial expression changed. "This tastes bland," he said flatly. Rachel apologized and offered to add more seasoning or make something else entirely. But Jackson snapped at her. "If you're going to be living here for free, the least you could do is learn how to cook something edible." He pushed the plate away and stood up abruptly. Then he told Rachel to clean up the mess she'd made in his kitchen before he walked away toward his bedroom without another word. The outburst caught Rachel completely off guard. It wasn't just what Jackson said, it was how rapidly his entire personality seemed to shift. He'd seemed so easygoing and friendly before that moment. Rachel quietly cleaned everything up and hoped Jackson had just had a bad day at work. Everyone has bad days, she told herself. It didn't mean anything. The next morning, Rachel actually apologized to Jackson. She didn't really think she'd done anything wrong, but she wanted to keep things smooth and avoid conflict. "I'm sorry about dinner last night. I'll try harder with the cooking." Jackson just laughed like the previous night's anger had never happened. Then he said something that made everything feel deeply wrong. "Maybe you could make it up to me by cleaning the house in your underwear today." He said it with a smile, like it was supposed to be a harmless joke. Rachel remembers freezing completely, her brain struggling to process what she just heard. "I'm not comfortable with that," she finally said. Jackson laughed again and told Rachel to relax, that he was obviously joking, then headed off to work. Rachel stood there after he left feeling profoundly unsettled. It was the first time she really thought that maybe there was something genuinely wrong with Jackson beyond just being occasionally moody. That was also the first time Rachel texted one of her close friends about the living situation and what Jackson had said. Her friend's response was immediate and unambiguous: "You're insane for staying there. Leave as soon as possible." But Rachel didn't want to leave. As weird as things were getting, she still felt like she had more control over her life there than she'd had living with her parents. Going back home felt like admitting failure all over again. The following Monday, Rachel was leaving the house to go grocery shopping with money Jackson had left for her. As she was driving down the street, a car behind her started laying on the horn aggressively. Rachel thought she'd done something wrong while driving, but the car kept following her, honking intermittently. Rachel started getting genuinely scared that something was seriously wrong with her vehicle or that she'd somehow offended someone. She pulled over to the curb. The car pulled up directly behind her, and a young woman got out and approached Rachel's window. She looked to be around Rachel's age, early 20s. The woman walked up and immediately asked, "Are you living at that house?" When Rachel confirmed that yes, she was, the woman's expression became deadly serious. "You need to stay away from that man. Right now." What the woman told Rachel next made her physically sick. Apparently, Jackson wasn't even his real name. This woman had been in the exact same arrangement before Rachel, the previous live-in housekeeper. She'd eventually realized that Jackson had cameras watching her constantly, far more than just the obvious ones in the kitchen and living room. She said Jackson started knowing things he shouldn't know, private things, personal things that could only be explained if he was watching her 24/7. When she tried to leave the arrangement, Jackson made it extremely difficult. He kept asking invasive questions about where she was going and when she'd be back, pressuring her to reconsider, making her feel trapped. Then the woman told Rachel the worst part. One night, she'd woken up in the middle of the night and seen Jackson leaving her bedroom. Just standing in her doorway, then walking away when he realized she'd woken up. Rachel felt her stomach turn. But the woman wasn't done. She said Jackson didn't actually have a job. He'd been lying about going to work every day. The previous housekeeper had eventually realized that Jackson was still somewhere inside the house most days, she just didn't know where. Maybe the basement, maybe one of those closed rooms upstairs. But he wasn't leaving for work like he claimed. Rachel sat in her car trying to process everything she was hearing. Every little weird thing suddenly started making horrifying sense. Rachel asked how she could leave without causing problems or putting herself in danger. The woman told her to act completely normal. Start slowly removing important belongings so Jackson wouldn't notice anything missing. When Rachel finally left for good, she should make it look like she was just running errands, casual, no big suitcases, no obvious signs of permanent departure. And most importantly, don't confront Jackson. Don't let him know you're aware of what he's doing. After the woman drove away, Rachel just sat alone in her car for several minutes, trying to calm down before returning to the house. When Rachel walked back inside, the entire atmosphere felt different. She felt like she was being watched even more intensely than before. That night, Rachel carefully checked her room the way the other woman had suggested. After a few minutes of searching, Rachel noticed something small on the top shelf of her closet, pushed back into the corner behind a box. When she moved the box slightly, she saw it, a tiny black camera lens pointing outward through a small drilled hole. Rachel slowly put the box back exactly how it had been, pretending she hadn't seen anything. Needless to say, she didn't sleep at all that night. She lay in the darkness staring at the ceiling, wondering what she'd gotten herself into and who might be watching her at that very moment. And Rachel is genuinely glad she didn't fall asleep that night, because at some random hour, probably around 3 or 4 a.m., she heard her bedroom door creak open. Rachel flipped onto her side and looked toward the door. Jackson was standing there in the doorway, just watching her. When he noticed Rachel looking at him, he quietly apologized for waking her and closed the door. Rachel lay there in terror, wondering what he'd been planning to do. What would have happened if she'd been asleep? She needed to get out immediately. The next morning, Rachel started executing her escape plan. Every day when Jackson left the house, or claimed to leave, Rachel would bring one small bag of belongings out to her car. Just normal everyday items, nothing obvious enough to raise suspicion. 3 days later, while Jackson was supposedly at work, Rachel left the house and never came back. Though based on what she now knew, Jackson could have been hiding somewhere inside the house, watching her pack up and leave. Jackson texted Rachel later that day asking where she was. Rachel kept her response simple and non-confrontational. She decided to move back in with her parents, and she thanked him for the opportunity. Jackson kept texting, asking why she was leaving, saying she should at least come talk to him in person before making a final decision. Rachel never responded again. About a week later, Rachel noticed something that still bothers her to this day. She got an email notification saying someone had attempted to log into one of her old online accounts, an account she rarely used anymore. The login attempt originated from the same town where Jackson's house was located. Rachel immediately changed all her passwords and security questions for every account she had. Rachel doesn't know what Jackson's real intentions were. And honestly, she doesn't want to know. Nothing technically happened to her, she escaped before anything explicitly dangerous occurred. But Rachel genuinely believes that if she'd stayed longer, something eventually would have happened. Something terrible. So if you ever see deals like that offering free housing from strangers online, just remember, nothing like that is ever really free. There's always a price. The question is what they're actually asking for. Now before we move on to our second story, I want to pause for just a moment. If you're finding this video engaging, please hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this content to more people who appreciate true horror stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I post videos like this regularly, and you don't want to miss them. Alright, let's continue. Because our next story proves that sometimes, the person you invite into your home isn't who they claim to be. Story 2, The Cleaner Who Never Left. This story comes from a man I'll call Robert. It happened beginning last fall when Robert hired someone to clean his house. Robert works long hours and lives alone in a modest 2-story house he'd purchased a couple years prior. It's small, actually more space than a single person really needs, but he bought it as an investment in his future. Over time, Robert started realizing he was falling behind on keeping the place clean. Between his demanding job and general exhaustion, the housework just kept getting pushed aside week after week. One night after work, Robert was scrolling through Craigslist and similar sites and saw a listing for house cleaning services. It was a simple, straightforward post: independent cleaner. Cash only. Flexible schedule. Robert figured, why not? Maybe this was exactly what he needed. He sent an email, and the cleaner responded the next morning. She said she usually did apartments but was fine doing houses too. They agreed on a day she could come by while Robert was at work. She asked a few normal questions: how big was the house, were there any pets, how many rooms needed cleaning. Robert told her no pets, relatively small house, 2 stories, and that he lived alone. Looking back, Robert wishes he hadn't mentioned that last detail so casually. They scheduled her first visit for the following Thursday. Robert met her very briefly before leaving for work that morning. Yes, before you ask, Robert hid anything valuable in his lockable closet before leaving. He wasn't completely naive about letting a stranger into his house unsupervised. The cleaner appeared to be maybe late 30s. She seemed very quiet, reserved. She barely made eye contact, but Robert figured she was just shy or introverted. Robert showed her around quickly, all the rooms upstairs and downstairs that he wanted cleaned. He told her she didn't need to worry about his home office. She asked where he kept his cleaning supplies, and Robert showed her the laundry room. Then she asked if Robert wanted her to come regularly, maybe every couple of weeks. Robert said maybe. He wanted to see how this first session went before committing to anything regular. Before Robert left for work, the cleaner asked what time he usually got home. Around 6 p.m., sometimes closer to 7 o'clock depending on traffic, Robert told her. At the time, the question didn't seem weird. She probably just wanted to make sure she'd be finished and gone before Robert returned. When Robert got home that evening, the house honestly looked fantastic. The floors were shining, Counters were spotless, everything smelled like cleaning products. Robert paid her the agreed-upon amount, and she left without much conversation. Nothing seemed wrong. For about a week, everything was fine. Then it started. Maybe 6 nights after the cleaning, Robert woke up around 2 or 3 a.m. He wasn't a great sleeper, so waking up randomly wasn't unusual. What was unusual was hearing a soft thump from somewhere downstairs. It sounded like maybe something settling or just one of those random noises houses make at night. Robert ignored it and went back to sleep. A couple nights later, Robert woke up again, and this time he heard what sounded like a cabinet door closing downstairs. Again, he assumed he was half asleep and probably imagining things. He didn't go check. He wasn't about to walk around a dark house at 3 a.m. over what was probably nothing. Robert wishes now that he had investigated. Over the next week, Robert started noticing small things that felt slightly off, but not quite alarming enough to really act on. One morning, a kitchen cabinet was open a few inches. Robert figured he must have left it that way. Another time, a dining room chair seemed pulled out slightly from the table. Again, Robert assumed he'd done it without thinking. One Saturday morning, Robert noticed the downstairs bathroom hand towel felt damp, like someone had used it recently. Small things kept happening. Things you could always explain away if you wanted to maintain your peace of mind. The nighttime sounds continued too, always soft enough to dismiss as house settling or imagination. Once it sounded like a single slow footstep on the floor, but Robert convinced himself it was probably the wood adjusting to temperature changes. Robert started sleeping with his bedroom door fully closed instead of cracked open like he usually did. He didn't want to admit to himself that he was getting genuinely uneasy, but he was. One night, Robert woke up almost certain he'd heard movement right outside his bedroom, like weight shifting on the floorboards in the hallway. He still didn't get up to check. He just stared at his door, waiting to see if the handle would turn. Nothing happened, and eventually Robert fell back asleep. The next morning, Robert felt stupid for being scared. He checked the whole house and everything looked completely normal. Around this time, Robert texted the cleaner about coming back again. Despite the weird feelings, she had done good work, and Robert figured maybe he was just stressed from his job and imagining things. She came again on a weekday while Robert was at work, same routine as before. Robert left the back door unlocked for her. When Robert got home that evening, everything looked professionally cleaned again. The cleaner asked if Robert wanted to schedule something regular going forward. Robert told her maybe once a month. Anything more than that seemed excessive and expensive. About a week after that second cleaning, Robert started noticing that food seemed to be disappearing slightly faster than it should. He could have sworn there was one more yogurt cup in the fridge the previous night, but now it was gone. The bread seemed lower than he remembered too. Robert was still trying to explain these things away rationally. Maybe he was eating more than he realized. Maybe he was going through food faster due to stress. But one morning, Robert found a glass in the sink that he was almost positive he hadn't used. He lived alone. He was single at the time. There was literally nobody else it could have been. At one point, Robert even wondered if maybe he was sleepwalking and doing things without remembering. He actually Googled information about sleepwalking and unconscious behaviors. Things really escalated one night when Robert woke up and clearly heard slow, deliberate footsteps downstairs. Not house settling. Not imagination. Actual human footsteps. Robert grabbed his phone and froze, listening intently. After maybe 10 seconds, he heard what sounded like something lightly bumping into a wall or piece of furniture. Robert didn't go downstairs. Fear genuinely paralyzed him in that moment. He just stayed in bed, sitting upright, for half an hour. He didn't hear anything else, and eventually he convinced himself it must have been nothing. Morning came, and Robert checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked tight. He even checked the basement, though he'd never heard any sounds coming from down there. Nothing. A few days later, Robert noticed something that really disturbed him. In his kitchen junk drawer, where he kept random items like batteries, takeout menus, twist ties, he also kept 2 spare house keys on a small ring. One of them was gone. Robert got immediate goosebumps when the obvious implication hit him. But he kept telling himself no, that's not possible. He must have moved it somewhere and forgotten. Robert searched the entire house but couldn't find the missing key anywhere. The cleaner had been alone in his house twice, for several hours each time. She'd had complete access to every room, every drawer. Robert started locking his bedroom door at night after that realization. About 4 nights later, Robert decided to test something. He left for work like normal in the morning, but after driving a few blocks away, he circled back and parked on the next street over. Robert walked back quietly and entered his house through the back door, then positioned himself upstairs where he could see part of the downstairs through the stair railing. Around 11 a.m., Robert heard his front door unlocking. Very soft footsteps entered the house. Robert carefully moved to where he could see through the railing. It was her, the cleaner. She just walked in like she lived there, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And she didn't have any cleaning supplies with her. She went into Robert's kitchen, opened his refrigerator, took out a drink, and sat down at his table. She just sat there quietly for several minutes, drinking and looking around. Then she stood up and walked slowly around the living room, picking up objects and examining them. She picked up a framed photo of Robert and his brother and just stared at it for an uncomfortably long time. Then she started walking toward the stairs. Robert backed up as quietly as possible into his bedroom and shut the door without making any noise. He honestly didn't know what to do. He didn't want her to know he was home yet, he wanted to see what she would do. After maybe a minute, Robert heard her footsteps coming up the stairs. Then they stopped. Robert could see her shadow under his bedroom door. She was just standing there in the hallway. Not moving. Not making a sound. It felt like a full minute passed, just that shadow under the door, completely still. Robert decided it was time to confront her. He couldn't just hide in his own bedroom. He flung the door open, ready to demand an explanation. What Robert wasn't expecting was that she was standing mere feet from the door, not at a normal distance down the hallway, but right there, as if she'd been about to reach for the handle. And when Robert got a closer look at her face, he realized something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't the same woman he'd hired. It was a different Hispanic woman, yes, but the build was different, the hair was different, the facial features were completely different. And there was something genuinely bone-chilling about her expression. She had this blank, almost hateful look on her face, emotionless but somehow still radiating hostility. Robert didn't say anything. Neither did she. They just stood there for several seconds in this horrific standoff. Then, slowly, the woman turned around and walked back down the stairs as if nothing had happened. Robert heard his front door open and close a few seconds later. His heart was pounding. He was shaking uncontrollably. Robert waited maybe 5 minutes before even moving, terrified she might still be in the house somehow. Calling 911 was difficult because his hands were shaking so badly. The police came and Robert explained everything. The original cleaner, the missing key, the sounds at night, the food disappearing, and now this different woman who'd been in his house. He gave them the phone number and email of the original cleaning woman, along with any other information he could provide. The original cleaner stopped responding to all contact completely after that day. Her number went dead. Her email bounced back. Robert replaced every single lock in the house that same afternoon, literally drove straight to the hardware store the moment the police left. What still bothers Robert to this day is something one of the officers said to him. The officer asked if Robert had given anyone else a key to the house besides the cleaner. When Robert said no, the officer just nodded slowly and said, "Sometimes people like that don't work alone." Robert never hired another house cleaner again. He cleans the house himself now, no matter how tired he is from work. Because he knows that sometimes, when you invite someone into your home, you're not just inviting them, you're inviting everyone they know. Alright everyone, we're almost at the final story, but before we get there, I need to ask you something. Are you still watching? Have these stories kept your attention? Then please, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. Leave a comment telling me which story has been the creepiest so far. And share this video with someone you know who loves true horror stories. Your engagement genuinely keeps this channel alive, and I appreciate every single one of you. Now, let's finish with a story that proves sometimes, the best deals are the ones that are too dangerous to even consider. Story 3, the $45 sectional sofa. This final story takes us back to 2008, almost 20 years ago now, though it doesn't feel that long. For anyone too young to remember, the early 2000s were sort of like the Wild West for the internet. Social media was just starting to emerge, safety precautions were basically non-existent, and people were far too trusting. This story comes from a man I'll call David. Back in 2008, David was in his early 20s and, by his own admission, he was reckless and overly trusting. He was the kind of person who would say things like, "That could never happen to me," while doing exactly the kinds of things that lead to bad outcomes. David just never had that sense of urgency or anxiety that keeps most people cautious. That changed one spring evening when David experienced firsthand that genuinely evil people exist in the world, and they're actively looking for victims. In 2008, Facebook had just started becoming popular, but most people David knew were still using MySpace. Social media existed, but not like it does today. Everyone had heard horror stories about the internet and meeting strangers online, but nobody David knew actually cared or took precautions. They were all incredibly, dangerously ignorant. The most insane website at the time, the one everyone used despite the obvious risks, was Craigslist. Craigslist still exists today, but it's nothing compared to what it was in the early 2000s. There was no Facebook Marketplace, no OfferUp, no modern alternatives. If you wanted to buy or sell something, you went to Craigslist. You could find anything from small trinkets to vehicles and everything in between. You could even find work or odd jobs for extra cash. David had friends who used Craigslist constantly and swore by it. They said it was the greatest website ever created. David never had much interest in using it until his life started falling apart in spring 2008. He was living with his girlfriend, and with almost no notice, she dumped him and kicked him out of their shared apartment. Thankfully, David wasn't homeless. He had friends who let him crash on their couches while he figured things out. David spent the immediate days after the breakup trying to find his own apartment, but it was proving much harder than expected on his $7 an hour salary. One of David's friends, one who swore by Craigslist, told David to check the site for possible rooms for rent or cheap housing options. That was a hard pass for David. He didn't know why exactly, but the idea of finding housing through Craigslist felt wrong to him on some instinctive level. However, David did start looking for furniture and household items to eventually fill whatever place he ended up renting, since his ex-girlfriend had kept everything after the breakup. At first, Craigslist seemed like a treasure chest. David could finally see why people loved it. He could find literally anything he needed, often at incredible prices. He was finding deals left and right. David's friend had a massive garage and let David store his purchased furniture there until he found his own place. One afternoon, David was searching for a love seat or small couch when he found a post from a guy named Keith who was selling an entire sectional sofa for $45. The post included a picture, and the sectional looked smaller and more manageable than most. It could fit in most standard living rooms. And it appeared to be in great condition. The price seemed almost too good to be true. But as David admits, he was ignorant and reckless. He just saw a cool couch at a low price tag. David messaged Keith, and to his surprise, Keith responded almost immediately saying the couch was still available. Keith seemed friendly and trustworthy over messaging, at least as trustworthy as anyone can seem through text communication on the internet. Keith explained that he'd gotten a new job in another state and was moving soon. He was just trying to sell his furniture quickly, hence the incredibly low price. The reason seemed legitimate enough to David. They exchanged phone numbers and set up a time to meet that evening to complete the transaction. A meetup that would go on to traumatize David for years and open his eyes to the horror that exists even in ordinary neighborhoods. David pulled up to the address around 9 p.m. that night. Most people would recognize that as a red flag, but not David at the time. Keith had said he had work commitments earlier in the day and couldn't meet until that hour. It didn't seem suspicious. The house was dark. And not just because it was nighttime outside. Everything about the property looked abandoned and desolate. It was a rundown street with almost no functional street lamps. The few that worked cast weak, flickering light that barely illuminated anything. There were several houses on the block, and they were all just as dark and decrepit looking as Keith's house. David tried calling Keith several times using the number Keith had provided, but he kept getting an automated message saying the number was no longer in service. David was about to give up and drive away when his phone buzzed. It was a call from a weird number with a different area code than Keith's original number. David answered and was greeted by a voice that immediately struck him as strange, friendly but somehow unsettling. The voice was deep and somewhat erratic. The man kept calling David fella, and started apologizing profusely about the phone situation. He said he'd broken his phone earlier and was now calling from his work phone. David was definitely weirded out, but not scared or genuinely uneasy. He was more annoyed than anything. Looking back with hindsight, the red flags are obvious. But in the moment, David's brain wasn't thinking about worst-case scenarios, he was thinking about getting that couch. Keith told David to meet him around the back of the house. He said he'd unlock the back door for him. David didn't question it for even a second. He just walked around to the back of the property. It was somehow even darker back there. David figured Keith would at least turn on some kind of exterior light to help him navigate, but there was nothing. David got to the back door and just stood there uncertainly. He didn't know if Keith wanted him to just walk inside or if Keith was coming outside to meet him. David decided to call Keith again on the work number. Instead of hearing the ringtone in his phone's earpiece, David heard a generic cell phone ringtone coming from behind him, not from inside the house, but from the bushes in the backyard. David hates to even admit this, but this was the first moment he finally felt some instinct that something might not be right. Keith suddenly ran out from the bushes, waving his ringing flip phone in the air. In that strange, overly friendly voice, Keith explained that he'd been taking out some old food scraps to feed the squirrels and other animals that lived in the bushes. He said he didn't mean to startle David. David told Keith it was fine, that he just wanted to see the couch quickly so he could be on his way. Keith said of course in a cheerful voice, then practically skipped past David, almost stumbling as he moved. They got to the back door, and Keith seemed to be struggling to open it. When Keith had told David to meet him in the back, David had assumed Keith would be opening the door from inside the house. He hadn't expected Keith to be trying to unlock it from the outside. This was David's first good look at Keith in the dim light. Keith was older, probably late 50s. Really skinny, almost unhealthily thin. He had long white hair pulled back in a greasy ponytail. Worst of all, Keith smelled terrible, like a dirty ashtray full of old cigarette butts. Keith pulled away from the door and asked if David could help him get it open. He said sometimes the door stuck and he was embarrassed that he couldn't get it unstuck himself. Keith told David to use his shoulder and push the door as hard as he could. At this point, David knew intellectually that something was wrong. But he was already committed to the situation, already standing there, and his brain was just going with the flow. David grabbed the doorknob and lowered his shoulder to push. The door didn't stick at all. In fact, as David lowered his shoulder with momentum, someone from the other side opened the door suddenly. David had built up so much force that he lost his balance completely and fell hard onto the floor inside. When David hit the ground, he heard Keith yell one word, "Now!" In the darkness of the room, two other people emerged from each side and grabbed David, holding him down against the floor. David started to struggle, but it was useless. One of the guys holding him was massive, probably over 250 pounds. Keith started kicking David in the face. Hard, repeated kicks. One of the worst aspects of the entire experience was the complete darkness. David couldn't see anything, which made everything feel exponentially more terrifying. David could feel his body starting to get weak from the beating. Keith told one of the other men to grab the tape. David heard the distinctive sound of duct tape being ripped. He couldn't even begin to imagine what they were planning to do. What happened next is probably the closest thing to a miracle that has ever occurred in David's life. During the chaos of David falling and being wrestled to the ground, he had accidentally pocket-dialed his friend, the friend whose couch he'd been staying on since the breakup. The sounds of David yelling and struggling were coming through the phone loud and clear. David's friend was frantically trying to get David's attention, yelling, "Hello? David? What's going on?" David made a split-second decision. He yelled at the top of his lungs, "I'm in the back of the house. Come help me." It was a complete bluff. David was alone. But he desperately hoped these men didn't know that. He was trying to scare them into thinking David had brought someone with him who was waiting in the car. The large man immediately eased his grip and looked toward Keith, who had stopped kicking. That single second of hesitation was all David needed. He wrenched himself free and ran out the door as fast as he possibly could, sprinting toward his car. David could hear them chasing him, footsteps pounding behind him, but he didn't look back. He reached his car, jumped inside, slammed the door, and locked it immediately before starting the engine. Just as David was peeling away, the large man reached the car and tried to open the driver's door even as the vehicle was moving. David just kept driving. He didn't stop. He drove for hours before finally going back to his friend's house, terrified that somehow those men might follow him and discover where he was staying. David eventually called his friend back and explained everything that had happened. Then he called the police. But by the time authorities investigated, it was too late. The Craigslist post had been deleted. The phone Keith had been using was apparently some kind of disposable burner phone that had already been ditched. David gave the police the best descriptions he could of all three men, but as far as he knows, Keith and his accomplices were never caught. They're still out there somewhere. What terrifies David every time he thinks about that night is considering their true intentions. This clearly wasn't just a robbery. Keith had lured David in with a $45 deal, barely any money at all. Whatever these monsters wanted, it obviously wasn't just David's cash. It was something so much worse. David sometimes goes down a mental rabbit hole thinking about what would have happened if he hadn't accidentally called his friend. If those men had successfully restrained him with duct tape, where would they have taken him? What would they have done? As David wrote this story down, he's fully aware of all the stupid choices he made along the way, meeting a stranger at night, going to an isolated location, not telling anyone where he was going, not bringing any kind of protection. He's just profoundly thankful he's still alive to recognize those mistakes. Because so many people who make similar choices don't get that second chance. 3 people. 3 Craigslist ads. 3 predators hiding behind friendly messages and too good to be true offers. Rachel, who escaped a man who was watching her every moment. Robert, whose home was invaded by people who had copied his key. And David, who nearly became the victim of something unspeakably horrible. These stories are real. The dangers are real. And these predators are still out there, posting new ads, targeting new victims. So the next time you see an online listing that seems too perfect, free housing, incredible deals, easy money, ask yourself why a complete stranger would be so generous. Because sometimes, what they are really offering isn't a deal at all. It's a trap. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Leave a comment and let me know which story disturbed you the most. And please, share this video with friends who need to understand that online marketplaces can be dangerous. Stay safe out there, everyone. Trust your instincts. And remember, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Until next time.